Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Hope you guys are doing well. Enjoyed the morning sessions. I have a 3-year-old son who will make brief comments now and then, possibly. But my name is Zara Snapp, and I work with an organization here in Mexico City, and we work throughout Mexico that's called Instituto RIA. And I'm really pleased to be able to be here this afternoon with all of you. I'm going to be moderating the afternoon sessions. And I know Julie Holland did a great job in the morning, and I was watching some of those sessions. So we look forward to continuing that here in track 1. We have a really exciting session coming up and just an afternoon of great speakers. I was going through the bios, and all the bios, the full bios are online. I'll just be saying short bios for folks so that we can get to know them, but really it'll be in the conversations that we can learn about the work that they're all doing. So I think we'll just get started and we'll just see if that sounds good to all my tech people. There's Jag. Yes. Hi. Technology. I can't hear you, but I can see you. Yeah, this is so exciting. Still can't hear you though. Here, yep. This is really the first all virtual conference I've been to, but I feel like this is going to become how conferences are done.
All right. Hi, Zara.
Hi, Jag. How are you doing?
Relatively okay, all things considered. Feel very lucky to be safe and comfortable at home here.
Yeah, I think this is a time when people who are doing okay are really grateful that we're doing okay, because there's so many folks who this is going to be really tough. And here in Mexico, it's been a whole nother trip, because we have so many people who work in the informal economy. We have so many people who, if you don't go out, you don't get paid. So really, I think this has been an experience that is highlighting just all the inequities that we see around us, but really deepening it. People who are incarcerated, people who are experiencing homelessness. And really, so this is great because we're having a conversation here with you today. And the title of this panel, although it's a panel of one, is Psychedelics and the War on Drugs. What can we learn from cannabis legalization and other social justice movements? So I feel like this is going to help us stream into our current realities. And how do we maintain these fights that we're winning right now around releasing people from prison, early release programs, or getting methadone and getting take-home doses? There's all these innovations that are happening that activists have been fighting for decades. And finally, because we're in this crisis, we're seeing these shifts. So I'm going to do a quick bio of you, and then I'm going to let you take over. So for those of you who don't know Jag, but I feel like everyone in these spaces should know who you are. You're the political and communication strategist with nearly 2 decades of professional experience. He is currently the director of communications for the Fines and Fees Justice Center, which works to break the cycle of punishment and poverty in the United States. And I met you, although I may have met you when you were at MAPS, but you previously served for 10 years as director of communications strategy at the Drug Policy Alliance, and you also previously served as the director of communications at MAPS. So you have been around, and you are, you know the organizations, and you know this topic, and I'm really excited to hear about, I had read some pieces you'd written about this, so I'm really excited to hear about how you feel like we can start integrating social justice into the psychedelic space.
Mm-hmm.
The floor is yours.
All right. Wow. Well, this is bizarre to be here, to be honest. It would be bizarre and kind of surreal to be talking with you all in the first place, but especially now. I join you from occupied Lenape territory, a couple blocks away from Shirakapak Rock, where Manhattan was, as the myth goes, sold to the European colonizers. Right now, my work is mostly focused on ending the criminalization of poverty, and right now focused a lot on trying to get people out of prisons and jails right now and to lessen the harms of the coronavirus for people impacted by the criminal justice system. Like Zara said, all of the harms and disparities that were already there are being really exposed and exacerbated right now. And I feel lucky to be able to work from home and talk to you from home, because I know a lot of people can't do that right now. I think it's important. Let's just back up here and talk about the drug war and mass criminalization a little bit first. The drug war has been around for 50 years, and really mass incarceration in the United States for 40 since the Reagan administration in the 80s. But the idea of demonizing certain drugs and having a dualistic way of looking at drugs and bifurcating drugs into good drugs and bad drugs is generally something that is pretty universal to cultures throughout history. And what has happened now is that mass incarceration has transformed into mass criminalization. We have 2.5 million people, or maybe a little less than that, a little over 2 million people behind prison and behind bars and jails, right this second at any given moment. But there's many more people cycling through them. And there's more than 7 million people under some form of correctional supervision, which is probation or parole, with very strict conditions where if you miss an appointment, you get thrown in jail. You fail a drug test for marijuana, even if your conviction had nothing to do with marijuana. And this burden falls overwhelmingly on the communities that are over-policed in this country, which are communities of color. And I'll be honest. I'll say there's a part of me that was a little bit, I'm a bit ambivalent about even speaking in these spaces at this point, because I feel like the psychedelic space has been behind the curve in a lot of ways in centering the voices of people who've been most directly harmed by our psychedelic drug policies. And I'm a white, straight, cisgender male who has a relatively privileged situation. And I think it's important that we continue. I think there's been a lot of steps in the right direction over the past few years, but I think that would really change the focus of the discussion in a lot of ways, and who benefits and who gets left out by certain reforms. It's been good to see. I've spoken for a long time about the need to look beyond medicalization. Medicalization has its benefits. It's not to say we shouldn't pursue that as one of many simultaneous reforms, but it doesn't do anything to change the criminal penalties in this country. And it would likely only be accessible to people with more resources. I think people tend to underestimate the harms of the criminalization of psychedelic drugs because it's the drug war and mass incarceration, as I was just saying, were so vast, and I barely even touched on it. And psychedelics are such a tiny part of that. But I think we don't know what the racial breakdown is of psychedelic drug arrests. I've been wanting that data for 15 years. But generally in this country, the way drug arrest data is kept, things are categorized into very broad categories. Oftentimes marijuana or cocaine or heroin is broken out, but psychedelics are not. So it requires going at the county level and the city level in each municipality. That's part of what's so hard about criminal justice reform in this country, is that there's thousands of municipalities with a lot of discretion, and only half of the states have a ballot initiative process. Only, I think, about 25 states. So the rest, you have to go through the goddamn legislature, which is generally a lot harder. And even just thinking about not just the arrests, which I think we need to look more into who's getting arrested and where and when. You always hear about it, festivals and places like that, especially in rural areas, there's always a lot of arrests. But then there's the other harms, people who are going to festivals who take all their drugs before they go in through the gate so they don't get caught with it, and end up overdosing or taking too much or not having the night they planned. Just the experience, the phenomenological experience of using psychedelics is different when you know that it's criminalized, and particularly that is really the case for people in marginalized communities. A lot of the people where I grew up, I was one of the few white people in the community, and many of my friends did not feel safe taking psychedelics, not necessarily because they thought they would get arrested, but just because they didn't feel safe in general, whether it's getting stopped and harassed by the police, or just knowing that the police are not there to protect you. So we ultimately have to change police practices if we want to get at the root of psychedelic criminalization. But I think there's a lot of benefits to the decriminalization of psychedelics that would be really interesting to interrogate and study further. At the same time, I feel, and it's very fascinating and exciting to see all of the movements popping up all over the country around decriminalization. It was an idea that many people like myself had floated for years kind of as a fantasy and never thought it would happen so soon. At the same time, part of the reason I'm ambivalent about it is that there's also simultaneously a movement all over the world to just decriminalize drug use and possession of all drugs. Portugal has done it. A lot of countries in Europe have very similar policies to Portugal. I mean, Czech Republic has a very well-established decriminalization program. There's some jurisdictions in the U.S. that have taken steps in that direction. And when you look at for example, in one of the talks earlier, one of the speakers said that a statewide poll of Colorado showed 54% support for decriminalizing psilocybin, I believe. And right now in the US, support for just a few months ago, there was a very methodologically rigorous national poll showing 55% support for decriminalizing all drugs. So I think breaking psychedelics off of it, I just don't think it's as big a deal and as revolutionary in some ways as it's being made out to be, if I'm being totally honest. And I think the people who are struggling the most under psychedelics prohibition, who are subject to law enforcement discretion. If I was a young person of color in Denver in a community that was heavily policed, would I still feel safe walking around with psilocybin in my pocket, knowing that there's no threshold amount set and it's at the police officer's discretion? There's a lot of limitations to it. And when you look at the benefits of decriminalizing all drugs, I mean, it has a lot of the same limitations. You're not regulating the supply. It's not dealing with distribution and sharing and stuff like that. But the number of people that would be helped would just be massively normal. In the US, the number one most common arrest altogether for the whole country is just drug possession. About 1.3 million people are arrested every year in the US simply for drug possession. And then also we know that I think one of the mistakes that was made with marijuana reform and the messaging around that was by framing it as, marijuana is a safer drug or a safe drug even. where I don't think drugs should be decriminalized or legalized because they're necessarily safe. I'm not being completely relativistic and saying all drugs are the same. All drugs are they all stand by the same principle that criminalization is not an effective policy. But that actually compounds the public health harms and is counterproductive to public health. But at the same time, sorry. But at the same time, there's some differences in how we think about policies there. We need to think about who is being left behind and who is benefiting. And, for a drug like opioids and heroin, people assume that decriminalizing encourages use, and that means that there's going to be more use. In places that have effectively transition to decriminalizing drugs like heroin and more dangerous drugs, less people are addicted to drugs. And so less drugs are getting used. So I think the benefits of decriminalizing more dangerous drugs are just so much greater. And the polling is the same, that strategically it makes sense to pool resources together and focus on uniting in decriminalizing all drugs. There's an initiative in Oregon this fall, as many of you know, to be the first in the US to decriminalize all drugs. And it also has very broad treatment and social services provisions in it. And very critically, it does not include involuntary treatment. One of the catches with decriminalization oftentimes is that people then can get forced or coerced into treatment. And the evidence really shows that involuntary treatment is much less effective and in fact quite harmful oftentimes. And the Oregon measure would take the law enforcement funding that's being put into arrests and use that to drastically expand funding, treatment, and also expand resources for housing and other social services to help the people, so let me, the one thing that people often don't believe when I tell them is that of the drugs that we think of the worst drugs, methamphetamine, heroin, crack cocaine, 80 to 90% of people who try them, according to the federal government's data, the federal government's data consistently shows that 80 to 90% of people who try heroin, crack, methamphetamine do not go on to become addicted. Our impression of them is associated with poverty, because those are the people that we're seeing, the people out on the street, the people who don't have a home, the people who don't have a safe space to use their drugs in. And it's compounding those problems. So I think I think there's kind of this assumption underlying the psychedelics space in a lot of ways that unites people who are really into decriminalization and people who are really into medicalization. And that I think both are following this underlying assumption that psychedelics are inherently better and safer than other drugs. And also that if more people do psychedelics, the world will be a better place. They might even help save the world, save humanity. And I think we need to rigorously question those assumptions. First of all, at the messaging research that I did at DPA, we found, this was 2 or 3 years ago, pre-pollen, so I have that caveat, but it found that, the vast majority of the US population does not think that psychedelics can be used safely in moderation. And there's a lot of drugs where almost every illegal drug has some medicalized version of it. Methamphetamine is basically Ritalin. Opioids, of course, we know about. Cocaine still has is Schedule 2 because it has medical uses as an anesthetic. So just because something is medicalized doesn't mean that it is going to become destigmatized necessarily, or people who use it outside of a medical context will become destigmatized. And I think, this idea that like the world, psychedelics make the world a better place. I think we have to really, my academic background is in anthropology, and I feel like I kind of had that idea at a certain point. And what I found from studying other cultures around the world, and this is my own experience, and other people have had different experiences, what it seemed to convey is that psychedelics generally, when they've been when they get integrated into a society, they get integrated into the social order of the society, and there's benefits and drawbacks to that. And I think, we need to, like, all of these studies like that show, increased nature relatedness for people who've used psychedelics. There's some like selection bias there, and there's some selection bias even in who chooses to use psychedelics in the first place. So there's a lot of like methodological and epistemological limitations there, just in self-censorship in the research field, the psychedelics research field, in terms of what questions are even getting asked. And the clinical studies also have to account for the preparation and the priming. And like, if you take that out of it, how much more variable would the results be? But I think, so I've talked about why I think drug decriminalization is perhaps a more effective strategy. I think in the long term, to reduce the harms, I think even if you're a psychedelic exceptionalist, I think out of your own self-interest, it's beneficial to join forces with the broader drug policy movement and other movements. The criminal justice reform movement, the public health movement, the other people who've been working in the trenches for decades, and get the buy-in from those communities before you go ahead to the city council and get their inputs. Something that you see over and over again with reforms, as so many people always say, the devil is in the details, and it's easy to underestimate the importance of implementation. And so many reforms get passed and then don't ever end up, people think they're kind of done after that point. And it takes a lot of time to build and entrench and grow those reforms. And I think in order for a reform to be successful, particularly a ballot initiative, it needs to have a few pieces in place. Generally, you want to make sure you have polling support. And you want to be thorough about that, and really look at like what all the other alternatives would be, because it's very easy to just reinforce your own assumptions with polling. It's a good idea to have funding, as we've seen, and I hate that, and I wish we didn't live in a capitalistic world. But right now, to get things through, as particularly with a ballot initiative, it does take some level of funding. It helps. And also, I think the third part that's easy to underestimate is buy-in from key stakeholders, taking the time to develop relationships with, the district attorney's office, the other criminal justice reform groups that have been working on reforms that encompass psychedelics reform already for a long time. And that have a lot of experience and success in and successful track record in building movements and in centering the directly impacted people. Don't rush it. And I think ultimately that will make this movement more sustainable. by building those alliances and bringing those people, into our movement, and joining their movements and not just asking them to to join ours. And you have to be careful. It's like with district attorneys and law enforcement, like law enforcement discretion is a double-edged sword. I understand why in Denver they didn't set one of the key tricky things figuring out with the decriminalization model is the threshold amount. What's the level that's considered distribution? And ideally, under some of the ideal decriminalization models, low-level selling would be decriminalized too. And you could gradually build it out from there. But when you give law enforcement discretion there, sometimes maybe there's a police chief this year who, who is on board with you, but then it changes next year, and you can't necessarily trust the police. And I think, there's a lot of resources out there. I should give a plug to, there's an organization in England called Transform that's put out for a long time these materials called the Blueprints for Regulation. And also, as there was a panel earlier by Scott Bernstein from Canadian Drug Policy Coalition about models to legally regulate all drugs. And I think it's important to note, I didn't note this earlier actually, because I think ultimately we need to move towards a model of legally regulating all drugs in order to reduce their harms and to effectively control their harms and reduce them. And I think there's a lot of models out there that we can draw from in building psychedelics models. But the polling in the US, the reason why say like DPA is focused on the initiative in Oregon to decriminalize all drugs is because polling is much higher for decriminalization than it is for legalization. Support for decriminalization it depends on the exact wording and the exact circumstances, but oftentimes it's over 50%. It's around 50% generally. With legalizing drugs, I haven't seen very recent polls on it, but consistently for a while, it's been under 20%, and even for psychedelics. And actually psychedelics, haven't been much higher than other drugs because the general public out there still doesn't see a huge difference between LSD and cocaine and heroin, despite Michael Pollan. So there's a lot of resources out there when it comes to building these models. We can also look to cannabis legalization and the pitfalls and benefits there. I think it's easy to underestimate. There have been some really significant benefits of cannabis legalization in the US. The fact that arrests have gone way down in each of the states that legalized, and arrests have gone down for all races. The racial disparities, on the other hand, have remained quite stark, and that's because policing practices haven't fully been reformed. But I think there's a lot of things there that we can learn from this. One of the things we learned, for example, that ties in with my current work is that there's generally, public health people generally feel like, okay, there has to be, if someone's out smoking on the street, there has to be some kind of punishment. We can't just allow that. And there's some rationale for that based on public health evidence. And you don't want to have a backlash in public opinion because people freak out about public smoking. But at the same time, generally it's homeless people and people who don't have a safe space to go who get tickets out on the street in legalization states for smoking in public. And generally they can't pay those tickets. Even a $250 fine or something like that, there's no way they're going to pay that. Most people right now in the US could not pay a $250 fine. Even before this crisis happened, what was the statistic? Like 50% of the US doesn't have $1,000 saved for an emergency. And I can't even imagine now how much worse it is and how much worse it might get over the next year. So we really need to look at the details of who is going to be impacted by these models that we're putting in place. Because once we put them in place, it's harder to change. You want to get it right in the first place, if possible, and not have to go back and change it later. You're going to have to go back and change it later, and you're going to keep trying to build on it, but you want to give yourself the best starting point possible. I don't know. I guess I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening to me.
You've been getting some really lovely comments here on the side. People are loving the things that you're bringing up. Just a few things. Thank you, Jag. Like if we could all be clapping. As Julie said, I can hear people clapping. You can't hear them. I'm the only one that can. I think you bring in so many interesting issues, even around like the data that we have. We do not have good data, and so it doesn't allow us to make clear policy recommendations. I know that in Canada, they don't even have racial breakdown of any sorts of arrest, including cannabis. So like now that they're trying to see how cannabis legalization is impacting folks, they don't even have data on how that changes. And so there's a guy named Kwame, who's in the University of Toronto, who's doing a lot of work on that. And some other things, you were speaking about the harms of drug policy, which I think is important too in these spaces to really be bringing up. We talk about harm reduction, and some other folks here were talking also about, I don't remember the term, maximizing benefits. And in Spanish, we use the term managing pleasure. So we talk about risk and harm reduction, and then how do you manage pleasure? And so these are some of the things that I think we do need to start like bringing into the discourse, because it helps us to also put people at the center, because then it's not really about which substance, but really about how our experience is as people who are using plants and psychoactive substances. I wanted to ask, are there some places, and we'll get to some of the questions that are here in our question box. So feel free to put in questions now, because we've got about 20 minutes and that's what we're going to be focusing on. Can you speak a bit about what might be some of the key lessons from cannabis? Like, is something working in the models that you've been proposing, in the models that Transform proposes? How would we integrate some social justice mechanisms into those?
Yeah, so there's a few things. The first measures back in 2012 and 2014 that those lacked. In 2016, Massachusetts and California became the first states to put some social equity measures in their bills or initiatives. One of them, for example, in California, a substantial amount of the tax revenue is reinvested in communities that have been worst harmed by mass incarceration and the drug war. So it's a form of reparations in a way. And have you witnessed that change on the ground in folks' lives? Where I've witnessed the most change in folks' lives, and where California took a step forward, and a lot of other places have taken a step forward since then, is on expungement and expunging people's records. When Colorado first passed, and the first few states passed marijuana legalization, they didn't make it retroactive. Generally, criminal justice reforms are not retroactive because for the legal system, it's like a mess and they don't want to deal with it, basically. And it's much harder to politically to let people out of jails than it is to say they won't be punished for it in the future, because they're hardened criminals now, thanks to the unjust laws. So in California, at first, it wasn't automatic, and people had to petition to get their record expunged. And that was very slow. DPA, where I worked at the time, set up workshops and tried to get people going. Eventually, one by one, jurisdictions started doing automatic expungement and saying, going back to like 1970, everyone, we're going to downgrade everyone's cannabis violations on their record to what it would be under the current law. Basically. But that was mainly at the discretion of
attorney general's offices, I believe. No, that's how it started.
Yeah, some of the more progressive attorney generals at the city level started doing that. And then eventually, I'm sorry, I can't remember right now which states have done that. I think some states have done that now. And another thing that, and I think that actually reinvesting the tax revenue is really the key thing, because that's the money. That's what really,
Yeah.
One of the other things that the Massachusetts and California measures had that has come forward in fits and starts, but not reached its full potential is social equity programs for licensing, where priority is given to people of color and people harmed by the drug war and licensing. That's been rolled out also at the local level. I know it really varies from place to place, so it's hard to comment on generally, but it's been fraught, and it hasn't always been, it's been delayed in a lot of places. But it's definitely worth pursuing. Although I think reinvesting the tax revenue in communities of color and directly in giving it to the people who have been harmed by marijuana prohibition and mass criminalization is, really like the most important thing. I think another thing that California took some steps forward on in 2016, and there's some big problems with California too, as people in California well know, so I'll get to that later. One of the other steps forward they took was in the criminal justice measures and trying to reduce the amount of people who still get involved in the system for cannabis, where people for example, in Colorado, they didn't legalize it for people under 21. So the number of youth arrests was still really high. And they were the only people getting arrested, which makes no sense. Why would you arrest a 20-year-old and not a 21-year-old? They're like, so in California, they made it where I think you have to do like an education course or something like that on drug education, or so there's, and also I think they put in the measure that the smell of cannabis cannot be used as presumption by police to search people, which is very important, because what happens a lot of the time, of course, cannabis can be used as a pretext whether or not it's legal or not. If they smell the smoke, they can come in and search you, and maybe they find, oh, you have something else on you too. That's a huge elephant in the room here, is most people don't only use one drug. That's part of the...
Most of us are poly users, poly consumers. Yeah. It's like, it just depends on what I'm feeling right now. I mean, that's also why we have now moved away in Mexico from talking about recreational use and medical use, because we talk about adult use. And I know that in California, you guys started doing that, adult and personal use. And so then it's like, because it depends on the day and how I'm feeling, it might be a therapeutic use. It might be a medical use. And then if I'm in a recreational setting, then it becomes a recreational use. And so it's like, we've also tried to, even in our own movements, we're creating legitimate types of uses, just like and that's what happens. We start replicating repression and oppression that we see in like the International Drug Control Conventions. Sorry, I just had to mention them because
totally what you said
they are what
and drug use is so important, because why do people use drugs? Why do most people use psychedelics? It's not for therapy or for spiritual uses, even if they do end up getting that benefit out of it. That's not why they're using it.
Or we didn't know it was for spiritual use when we started. I mean, I think that's important. So we've been doing a lot of work. I just want to mention quickly, in Mexico, we've been trying to figure out, on an academic level, and then how do you bring it down to a policy level of like principles of social justice and what that actually looks like. And so when we started doing some of the research, it's like, you have to recognize that there has been privilege and oppression in the system. And so there's already structural conditions in place. You have to recognize the historically groups that have been vulnerated or their rights have been violated, usually by the state, primarily by the state. That's the main state violent actor is the state. You have to recognize those groups. You have to generate affirmative actions towards those groups within this new regulation model. And then you have to repair the harms, and you have to figure out how do you really use these sorts of policy changes to kind of begin digging out the inequities that we're seeing. And Dr. Monica spoke about this in a panel or in a conversation earlier of, these are just, it's structural. And so until you start dismantling the structure, how do you begin to look at that? And so for us, it's not people who are African American in Mexico, it's people who are cultivating plants, psychoactive plants. And so how do you decriminalize? It'd be really hard to decriminalize people who cultivate. So that's where you automatically move towards regulation, because that's the way you guarantee rights. In decrim, and let's just go to that question now. Someone asked about how Portugal, and then I'll get back to the top one. You mentioned Portugal as an example. Can you speak to some of the areas where Portugal's drug policy is still not ideal?
Yeah, absolutely. Portugal in 2001, they had a big AIDS crisis and overdose crisis, and high rates of heroin use in the 90s. And in 2001, the president then, who's now the head of the UN, actually, they instituted the most comprehensive drug decriminalization measure. So it's the easiest to study all at once. Yeah. Use has generally stayed about the same, but the rates of addiction and youth use have gone down. No one is forced. If you're caught with drugs, they refer you to a social services commission, but you can't be punished. If you don't go, they're not going to punish you or fine you or put you in jail. The limitation of it is that it's not regulating the supply, and that most people who end up so the vast majority, I know in the US, the vast majority of people in prison for drugs are there for selling them, who get long sentences, about 2/3 of them. And most of those people are very low-level sellers, not people who are barely eking out a living, people who use drugs themselves and we're sharing them and pooling resources together. So it doesn't necessarily take that into account. And also the safety of the supply. It does make it easier for harm reduction services in some ways, like drug checking and things like that. But there's definitely limitations to it in terms of, the police bias and the supply.
Well, and somebody asked about this, they are beginning to do drug checking. I was there, in October of last year, and they are beginning to do some drug checking, but they're beginning to open some supervised consumption sites, but it's still slow, I think but they are the best example that we had. And really, also, I would say that these European models of decrim, beginning with Portugal, Czech Republic, and other places, they are doing drug checking. They have a place in Lisbon which is now doing drug checking with So, but
I mean, something skeptics would say about Portugal as well. They have universal healthcare, and that's a very important point. That's very helpful. But I think still in the US, even without universal healthcare, the benefits would still be substantial. I mean, you need to redirect as much resources as possible into voluntary treatment, not involuntary treatment. But it's still, because involvement with the criminal justice system is so counterproductive to public health for communities, there would still be huge health benefits, even without universal health care, which I hope
because they moved all drug issues from the justice ministry to the health ministry. It was like, that is a paradigm shift of just like, those are not going to be the folks, that's not going to be the authorities that have contact with people who are using drugs. It's going to be health people and all of that around there. And so I would say Portugal, for us, it was, and this is what I was coming at, like the European model has worked for Europe in dealing with some of their issues, but it's definitely something that for those of us in Latin America, it doesn't go far enough, because if you are a country that produces plants and psychoactive substances, then you don't have a place for you in there. And that's because most all of theirs is being imported. And so it really does become, it's a policy, but it only goes so far. It does not deal with the whole production chain. And somebody here, Catherine, had mentioned that regulation maybe does not guarantee rights. I totally agree that in many of these structures, exactly what I was saying. What we've been doing is we've been creating policy options that fit into our into our model of the economy and how things work and who wins and who loses, rather than thinking, how are we going to kind of restructure this new kind of model? And in Mexico, what we're working on then is, how do you guarantee certain licenses to people for longer periods of time? How do you break up vertical integration? How do you, the goal is that it would guarantee rights. Obviously, as humans, when we implement this, sometimes it's not possible, but it's you have to get it into the law. And I think, Shailene Title is somebody who's doing great work in Massachusetts in making sure that that happens. And there's lots of other folks around who are trying. I think Kat, I forget her last name, in LA, in the city of LA. So it really is, it's happening, but it has not been, it's not easy, because it wasn't in the minds of folks at the beginning. That's not like a topic that comes up well with constituents when they're voting. And so that was also, they were trying to win ballot initiatives. I think, so I want to go to the top question, but I'm going to wait for Jag to reconnect. Something happened. Monica brought up also that, discretion, we shouldn't leave discretion in the law. And I 100% agree with that. We need to make sure that when we're allowing for discretion, then we're allowing for the authority to make discriminatory decisions about who and how to deal with issues. And we need to have, and so that's why I'm with you, Jag, on that. I think we should allow smoking where cigarette smoking is allowed, because folks who are smoking outside is probably because they don't have their own private space to be in to smoke. And that's something we've been, pushing for, that we would need to have places, Cat Packer, that's right, places to really, to consume any substance that we want to have. So we have this great question. Can you speak on the intersection of the decriminalization, ending the drug war movements, and the entrance of wealthy conservative players coming into the psychedelic scene? There's clear contradictions at play here. So we can really think about this also with the Silicon Valley, and just how MAPS has been able to raise money has been amazing to me. And we wouldn't be able to do it without some of these really wealthy people. But at the same time, it can be, strange bedfellows.
Yeah, it's definitely surprising. When I worked at MAPS, it was just like me and 3 22-year-old friends in a house that Rick Doblin built in the suburbs of Florida. Now it's like 70 people. And I don't know, it's fascinating to study in some ways and to see it happening, but it's not, it just doesn't feel that surprising. I don't get freaked out about it the way other people. It's like, well, what did you expect with medicalization? Like, inevitably, there's going to be businesses that come in and want to capitalize on it. And want to monopolize it ultimately. And yeah, that's definitely a big danger when it comes to, if you are only getting approved a drug. It doesn't, even if it's done under a nonprofit context, it's still not going to make psychedelics legal for people who are using them outside of a medical context. So it's still kind of a monopoly on who can use it and where and when and under what circumstances. It's just who is going to benefit from that. And I hope nonprofits like MAPS can succeed in that space. But like, look at the world we live in. Psychedelics. It's a lot of what happened in the cannabis legalization space, where you have people coming into the movement who don't know they're people who already have good access to psychedelics in the first place. Rich, these well-off white people are generally, not having any trouble there. So they're going to have different priorities. And it's good to see that, like the open letter that came out last year, the psychedelic groups working together to try and form a united front there. But,
it's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah, I think. Well,
and it might just be just recognizing that those folks are operating in these spheres, and so then how do you ensure that their voice doesn't take on more? And just as like Monica was saying, that means we need to diversify the spaces that we're in, so that other voices can be challenging some of those other interests.
Well, and that shows the importance with these psychedelics initiatives that are getting proposed and passed now of really getting the details right in them and thinking them through in the long term about who is going can potentially benefit from them. I like the idea of like expanding the Spain social club model to other places, or maybe with psychedelics. As
we could all have our little peyote garden, and we would each get one cactus.
Yeah, or have a small neighborhood cooperative, where you pull resources and it's not commercialized. There's lots of non-commercial models. Legalization does not equal commercialization. It does not have to.
It doesn't have to.
That's the fight now. And medicalization is like, I don't see how it's avoidable with that. But with decriminalization and legalization, that's what is the
you have to come up with these. Then you have to come up with several ways to access, and that's something that in some of the initiatives in the States I've been worried about. And even like when they did the decrim Oakland, it was like yay, but at the same time, why didn't we just decrim all drugs? Because you got the signatures, so you could. I'm not questioning who worked on the decrim. I'm just saying like there is a question of maybe we should have just allowed anyone to have a personal amount of substances. And so that's where we do, I think it's okay for us to push our boundaries on this, because it doesn't, you then should be permitting cultivation for personal use of any substance that you can cultivate, and some social clubs that definitely could work around other substances, as well as a regulated model. No, and those can be the counterparts to a commercial model if that commercial model has to be in there. No,
the commercial. The communications person in me, though, is like, it has to be done in a way that doesn't provoke public backlash. And that takes very deep research and engagement with what your community and the country's underlying assumptions and values are about this stuff, which we mostly don't know.
Well, and then there's a whole nother piece on, like, in Mexico, we have a lot of tourism around psilocybin. And so do we want to take that away, or do we want to maintain that? And how do you maintain a cultural space, but that is dependent on tourism? These are big questions. They're great questions. And we should decrim everything. And we would, on our side, we would probably, we advocate for the regulation of all substances. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming up with these questions. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. If you want to shout out just one, what are some national organizations that you would recommend partnering with for a broader decarceration policy? And we will close with that, Jag.
That's a great question. It's really localized in a lot of contexts, because most criminal justice reform is at the local level. Most law enforcement is carried out at the local level. But I would, look at who the criminal justice reform groups are. Look at who the groups are working harm reduction and mutual aid and stuff like that. And working on the broader issues around criminalization and poverty. And you can follow me on Twitter. That's where I keep.
Great. Do you want to give us your
up to date? It's just Jag Davies on Twitter.
Perfect. So that's a good place to get in contact with him. Jag, thank you so much. I feel like we could have talked for a lot longer. And thank you, all of you, for your questions. We are already moving on to our next speaker. So we're going to, thank you, Jag. Amazing.